Have you ever wondered what success actually is for? Because we spend a lot of our lives pursuing achievements. For example, we try and get better grades, promotions, influence, even recognition. But even when we receive those goals, what happens afterwards? I feel many people use success to build their own legacy. But in 2 Samuel chapter 8, we see David, who does something quite different. After David wins battle after battle after battle and receives immense wealth, expands his kingdom farther than Israel had ever known, he gives the glory and the treasure to God. And this chapter asks a really deep question. When God blesses you, who ultimately benefits? Is it you or is it his kingdom? And today we'll discover why David's victories are really God's victories. In this episode of Biblical Unlocks, this show is designed to help build your habit of reading the Bible, understanding the Bible, and applying it in your daily life. If you enjoy episodes like this, please consider following and rating the show. It's free, it helps you out a lot, and you can always change your mind later. Now let's get a little bit of context into the chapter. Okay, so 2 Samuel chapter 18, we see that following the covenant promises of 2 Samuel 7, Chapter 8 is going to demonstrate how God's faithfulness is beginning to unfold in history, because God had promised David rest from his enemies, a great name, an enduring kingdom, and now we're going to see that these promises are becoming fulfilled, or they're beginning to be fulfilled anyway. So David actually defeats the Philistines, the Moabites, Zobah, the Arameans, who are the Syrians, and Edomites, and his influence stretches from the Mediterranean Sea towards the Euphrates River, approaching the territorial boundaries that God had actually promised long ago to Abraham, if we read Genesis chapter 15, verse 18. Yet the chapter is not just a record of all of his successes. The narrator here says something quite important, and he repeats this. The Lord gave victory to David wherever he went. And that's the important point of the chapter. David's greatness is actually it's all due to the Lord, right? God's covenant faithfulness is the reason why David is great, and David's greatness alone is not the ultimate story. And the chapter actually concludes not with like a few more military battles, but David actually organizes the government of Israel and characterizes it by justice, faithful administration, and worship. Alright, so let's take a look at verses 1 to 12. The focus here is going to be David defeating his surrounding enemies and David dedicating all the spoils to the Lord. So, verses 1 to 12, let's read. Sometime afterward, David attacked the Philistines and subdued them. David took Metheg-Ammah out of the hand of the Philistines. He also defeated the Moabites and, making them lie down on the ground, measured them off with a cord. He measured 2 lengths of cord for those who were to be put to death and 1 length for those who were to be spared. And the Moabites became servants to David and brought tribute. David also struck down the king of Zobah, Hadadezer, son of Rehob, as he went to restore his monument at the river Euphrates. David took from him 1,700 horsemen and 20,000 foot soldiers. David hamstrung all the chariot horses but left enough for 100 chariots. When the Arameans of Damascus came to help King Hadadezer of Zobah, David killed 22,000 men of the Arameans. Then David put garrisons among the Arameans of Damascus, and the Arameans became servants to David and brought tribute. The Lord gave victory to David wherever he went. David took the gold shields that were carried by the servants of Hadadezer and brought them to Jerusalem, from Betah and from Berothai, towns of Hadadezer. King David took a great amount of bronze. When King Toi of Hamath heard that David had defeated the whole army of Hadadezer, Toi sent his son Joram to King David to greet him and to congratulate him because he had fought against Hadadezer and defeated him. Now Hadadezer had often been at war with Toi. Joram brought with him articles of silver, gold, and bronze. These also King David dedicated to the Lord, together with the silver and gold that he dedicated from all the nations he had subdued, from Edom, Moab, the Ammonites, the Philistines, Amalek, and from all the spoil of the king of Zobah, Hadadezer, son of Rehob. Okay, so we read verses 1 to 12, and we see that there are many nations listed here, many victories that he has obtained. and you see that there are the Philistines, the Moabites, Zobah, and the Arameans, and each one of these nations had actually threatened Israel at one point or another during its history. Now, one after the other, they all fall under David's rule. So again, God is fulfilling promises he had made centuries earlier. When God spoke to Abraham, he promised that his descendants would inherit a vast land. And during the period of the Judges, Israel possessed only fragments of the land. But now what do we see? We see that Israel, under David, is actually beginning to catch up with some of those promises. And the other thing that we're seeing here is that we read in verse 6, right at the end of verse 6, that the Lord gave victory to David wherever he went, right? So he doesn't actually glorify David, right? The writer of this text. He doesn't celebrate the fact that David had military genius or whatever. It doesn't matter, okay? Instead, he attributes every victory to God. And this is actually the covenant theology here. Even if David fought courageously, even if his, generals planned wisely, that's not really important. Even if his soldiers were very brave, doesn't matter. Every human action should be understood under the sovereign hand of God. And the Bible consistently holds this truth together, that God ultimately accomplishes his promises, but success never belongs alone it doesn't belong solely to human effort. It involves God as well. We see something interesting here, right? The horses are hamstrung. I don't know if you caught this. The horses are hamstrung. This is a very subtle point, but I want to explain this because it's quite cool. David captures many horses and chariots, but only keeps a small number. And the reason why is because, you would think, maybe I should get as many as possible because I want to bolster my army. But this actually goes back to Deuteronomy chapter 17, where Israel's kings was specifically warned, you shall not multiply horses to yourself. And the reason why is because horses, in some sense, represented military self-reliance. That is, ancient nations, they would trust in their chariots the same way modern nations, for example, will trust in their military power or economic power, whatever. So David deliberately limits his military resources. It's very similar to what we saw with Gideon in the 300. They limit the military resources because this is actually anticipating Psalm chapter 20. Some trust in chariots and some trust in horses, but we will remember the name of the Lord our God. So true faith here is expressing itself through deliberate restraint. And David is building his confidence in the Lord and not his chariots. But the key thing to remember from this section of verses is that David dedicates all his treasures to the Lord, whatever it is, and he receives an enormous amount of wealth, but he dedicates it to the Lord. And that's a contrast from Saul, who repeatedly kept what God told him to surrender. He kept it for himself. Okay, let's read verses 13 to 18. Focus here is going to be victory over Edom and David's administration. Verse 13, David won a name for himself. When he returned, he killed 18,000 Edomites in the Valley of Salt. He put garrisons in Edom. Throughout all Edom, he put garrisons, and all the Edomites became David's servants, and the Lord gave victory to David wherever he went. So David reigned over all Israel, and David administered justice and equity to all his people. Joab, son of Zeruiah, was over the army. Jeshaphat, son of Ahilud, was recorder. Zadok, son of Ahitub, and Ahimelech, son of Abiathar, were priests. Sariah was secretary. Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, was over the Cherethites, and the Pelethites, and David's sons were priests. Okay, so right at the end of the chapter, what do we notice? I think we notice a few things, for starters. The first thing is the Lord gave victory to David wherever he went, so that's repeated again in verse 14, because if you see something repeated in Hebrew, it's very rarely accidental. It's a truth that the narrator wants us to remember. David is not invincible. God is faithful. And there's a difference between those two things, because God will keep continuing his blessings, and they begin, when God gives you blessings, it's very easy to attribute them to yourself, right? It's your own good. But I think the most important message of the entire chapter is that 2 Samuel chapter 8, even though it records a lot of military successes, it's not about military success. Even though David wins, he worships and dedicates everything to the Lord. Everything flows out to the Lord. And that's important because his success becomes a blessing for others. And this is a principle that is going to run throughout Scripture. God blesses his people, not so the blessing ends with them, but that it flows through them to other people. Because Abraham was told, I will bless you, right? And so that you will bless all the other nations. And David was established to shepherd Israel. So the church actually receives grace in order to proclaim that grace to the ends of the earth. And God's gifts are not meant to terminate on ourselves. They're meant to propagate. Okay, let's see how this chapter fulfills Jesus Christ. Okay, so David's victories point beyond themselves to a far greater king. The prophets repeatedly portray the Messiah as the son of David, whose kingdom will extend to the ends of the world. But there is a difference, because David is the one who subdues earthly nations, but Jesus Christ conquers the deeper enemies that enslave every single person, nation, and tribe. That is sin, death, and Satan. So, even though David expands Israel's borders, Jesus gathers people from as we read in Revelation, every tribe, nation, language, and people shall worship him in this one eternal kingdom. And David, whilst he dedicates the treasures of the conquered kings to God, Jesus presents redeemed men and women to his Father as the trophies of his victorious grace. So, David's victories come through battles. Christ's greatest victory came through what looked like a defeat at the cross. What looked like the triumph of evil actually became the decisive conquest over every spiritual enemy. As we read in Matthew chapter 28, verse 18 to 20, all power is given unto me in heaven and in earth. Go ye therefore and teach all the nations. David's kingdom stretched from sea to river, but Christ's authority extends over heaven and earth. Okay, so applying this chapter, it's really important because we will be in a situation in our lives. Sometimes we don't have successes, sometimes we do. But when we do have successes, how do we dedicate those successes back to God? How are you a blessing to all other people, right? Let's say you get a good grade, a promotion, an answered prayer, financial stuff. I don't know, whatever it is, a good opportunity. Consciously thank God for it. Okay, so we saw in 2 Samuel chapter 8 that the Lord, not David alone, is the source of every triumph, and that God's blessings are designed to flow through his people to others, and that David's kingdom ultimately foreshadows the worldwide and the eternal reign of Jesus Christ. Next time in 2 Samuel chapter 9, we're going to see how the story actually slows down a little bit. After all the battles and victories, David asks something. Is there still anyone left of the house of Saul, that I may show him kindness for Jonathan's sake? And we'll meet the forgotten and crippled Mephibosheth, who we saw in 1 Samuel. And we're going to see one of the most beautiful pictures in the Old Testament of grace and how David's covenant kindness points directly to the mercy Jesus Christ shows to undeserving sinners. You don't want to miss it. So that's it for this episode of Biblical Unlocks. If you enjoyed this episode, please feel free to rate the show and follow. It's free, it helps you out a lot, and you can always change your mind later. Otherwise, just have a blessed day. And remember, if you're not in your word, you're in your feelings. Godspeed.